Welcome to our Sound for Video session, Soundies. Today is the 3rd of November, I believe. Is that right? Indeed, it is. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Thanks for joining us. And if you're joining later, thanks for watching later. Wanted to talk a little bit about timecode today. And I think that this is a topic that seems to have generated a lot of interest recently. I think it's largely because there are more audio recorders available on the market now that actually have timecode generators built into them, including the MixPre 2 series, the Zoom F6, F4, F8. And then there are also a number of cameras, of course, who now claim, hey, we'll send timecode via our HDMI outputs. So we're seeing some interesting things and getting a lot of interesting questions about it. Andre, welcome to the session. Let me just go ahead and cover a couple of things first here. I think, it'll be a while before people will kind of trickle in, but I want to talk first of all about when to use timecode. I have to confess, I don't use it all the time. So when I'm shooting a YouTube video, I don't use it. I just record my audio separately. I just clap at the start of the take, and that's it. Then I sync it in post. It's not a problem. Now, the reason I do it in that case with YouTube videos is that the way my workflow works for YouTube videos is that I basically do what I call my main storyline recording. So that's going to be the talking head, and that's done all in one take. So there's basically one clip of video and one clip of audio that I come back to my computer with when I'm done shooting that. So for that purpose, I like to keep my production workflow as simple as possible, so I don't even bother with timecode. I just shoot and then sync in post, period. And so that's what I mean by simple in that case. Actually, a lot of my corporate video work too is very simple like that as well. It's basically a talking head with a whole bunch of B-roll layered on top of it. And in those cases, likewise, I don't usually use timecode. So that's what I mean by simple. Now, where do I find timecode most useful? I think it's really, really helpful in cases when you're shooting narrative films, even if it's a short film. And because typically, even when you're doing a short film, you come home after a shoot when you're the production sound mixer with easily, at least 30 takes. And so in those cases, you're starting to get to the number of clips that it does become a little bit more work to sync them all up. And I think in those cases, it definitely makes sense to put in the extra effort. Now, that's just how I do it. I'm not here to say to people that you have to use timecode all the time, or you should only use timecode when you're doing narrative work. That's just how I do it. And for me, and I've got a lot of timecode gear available to me. I've got Tentacle Sync Studio, which makes it very easy. I've got all the nonlinear editors that can do timecode sync. So it's not as if I don't have the tools available. I don't find it as useful. It's just another thing that has to be set up at the start of each shoot. So I don't generally bother with it when I have those really simple workflows. Now, again, as I mentioned, when I get to narrative workflows, that's where things change. And that's where almost always then I'll use timecode. Now, what I find is that if you're working in independent film, you may have to do some education. So if you're acting as the sound mixer on a team that's doing independent film, say short narrative film or whatever, a lot of the DPs and a lot of the directors aren't going to know how to use timecode. It's just the reality in independent film. And so you may have to do some education. I always ask the director and or DP, hey, are we doing timecode on this shoot? And in fact, I worked with one group, my friends, Levi Whitney and Austin Berenyi. Austin's the director, Levi's the DP. And for the longest time, I'd ask him at the start of every one. And finally, Levi said, I don't know how that works. I don't know how to do that. And so I said, look, let's just hook up the timecode generator to your camera, and I'll show you how to do it all in post. And so we did that. And now that little team is dedicated to using timecode whenever we do a narrative shoot. So there may be some circumstances there where you're going to have to do some educating. So just something to keep in mind. A topic that comes up a lot that I've had a lot of questions about recently is timecode sent via HDMI. So that's usually going to be a camera that has an HDMI output, and the camera manufacturer advertises, hey, our camera sends timecode via HDMI. And then there are also on the recorder end of things, the audio recorder end of things, there are some things there as well. We'll come back to that in just a second. So these camera manufacturers, as far as I'm able to tell, I did a little bit of research, and I'm not 100% on this, but from what I can tell, there is no HDMI standard, technical standard for how to send timecode over HDMI, as far as I could see. And so it looks like each camera manufacturer does it, kind of their own way, which means that on the receiving end, if we're talking about an audio recorder, it has to be able to know how to read timecode from various sources. And so there's a lot of considerations there. So for example, of the recorders that can read timecode via HDMI, we have the Mix Pre series. A lot of the Atomos video recorders can. And then there's also the Tascam DR701 that can. So I'm going to put in the description below. They each maintain a camera compatibility list. So I'll put those links down below so you can see what those are. The one thing Tascam says, which I thought was interesting, is that basically the Tascam, if you leave the HDMI cable connected the entire time between the Tascam recorder and the camera that's sending timecode, that it will prevent drift on long takes. So this is an interesting topic here as well in regards to timecode that I don't know that a lot of people realize how timecode works. Typically with kind of a free run timecode setup where you have a timecode generator that's been jam synced already to the recorder's timecode generator and is connected to the camera. Basically, when you start recording on the camera says, okay, let's get the timecode from the timecode generator that's plugged into us, write that time, the start time, to the metadata in our video clip. That does that. The audio recorder does a similar thing. It takes the time from its timecode generator or one connected to it, and it writes that to the start of the audio clip. And then in post, what happens is whatever software you're using is it takes the timecode timestamp in the video clip and the timecode timestamp in the audio clip, and it basically lines those up. So it can say, okay, like the video clip, for example, it has the timestamp from when it started, what the timecode reading was at that point, and then just counts the frames forward. And it finds a common frame between the audio and the video and syncs them up at that point. What it doesn't do, however, in that circumstance is if you do a really, really long take, say, for example, you're recording like a conference or something, some speaker up on a stage, and it's an hour and a half talk. What'll happen a lot of times is the devices will drift from each other. Usually, I think it's the camera, versus, unless you're using a consumer grade audio recorder. And so what happens, you can still get drift. It lines those two up at the start, but if there's drift later down the road, you're still going to have out of sync issues later in the recording. So that's one thing to consider. Tascam claims they essentially take care of that issue. If you're using one of the compatible cameras plugged into the DR701D, evidently the audio recorder adjusts its clock to go by the camera's clock, which is being sent via timecode over HDMI. So that's an interesting thing. So if you are doing long form video, that may be something to consider. Timecode is not a surefire solution for keeping sync on long takes. That's where Genlock comes into play, and I've never done that workflow, so I don't know a whole lot about it, but basically what happens with Genlock is you have a master clock, and the master clock is actually telling the camera when to capture its next frame, and also doing this basically the same thing to the audio recorder. So it's a kind of a different workflow where the master clock is actually in charge, whereas with timecode, the timecode generator is not actually in charge, just the camera and the audio recorder capture the timecode, timestamp at the time of the start of recording, and put that in metadata, and that's all it does. So that's a distinction there that's pretty important. All right, moving on. So another thing that can come up with latency with HDMI timecode is latency, and this becomes a particular problem if, for example, you're recording to something like an Atomos recorder, So the Atomos recorder is getting an HDMI feed from your camera, and then you may also be sending audio or maybe have a timecode generator connected to the Atomos recorder as well. The trick in those circumstances is that there's almost always, in my experience, especially with consumer grade cameras, on that HDMI signal coming out of the camera, there's a fair bit of latency. And so that's going to create essentially an offset for your timecode. So if you're sending timecode into the Atomos recorder, when you pressed record, um, things may be a little off. So that's something to consider. And in fact, the Atomos recorders have they do have an offset that you can apply if you're feeding audio directly into the Atomos recorder, because to account for that HDMI latency coming off the camera. So that's something you can experiment with your particular setup. So definitely something to consider there. Another challenge is pass-through issues. So a lot of people have asked about being able to, for example, if you have a setup or a rig that includes a camera, an Atomos recorder, and an audio recorder which can take HDMI timecode, there are some challenges that come along with that as well. So what a lot of people have tried to do is send HDMI from their camera to the Atomos recorder, and then on the pass-through port or the HDMI output port from the Atomos recorder, send that to the audio recorder. The problem is that in most cases, the HDMI timecode gets to the Atomos recorder, but it doesn't get passed back out to the audio recorder, or perhaps it puts it somewhere else. Whatever the case may be, the audio recorder typically doesn't recognize it. So definitely something to consider. Now, some people have found workarounds where instead of feeding the HDMI signal to the Atomos recorder and then to the audio recorder, they use a powered HDMI splitter to feed the HDMI out into the splitter, and then from the splitter going into the Atomos recorder and the audio recorder. So that's a potential workaround there. Although I think in most cases of the people that have talked to me about that workflow, the only ones that I've seen so far are powered HDMI splitters that appear to be working. So that's a challenge now because you have to have an additional device on your rig that needs to be powered. So something to keep in mind. All right. Let's talk a little bit about software for syncing in post. There is, I think probably my favorite is the Tentacle Sync Studio, but it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And I'll talk about one of the challenges that I just encountered this morning. Someone sent me an issue that they had with it, and I'll describe that in a little bit more detail. But today, basically, all of the nonlinear editors, the video editing apps, can basically sync using timecode. Not a big deal. Except if you recorded timecode to the audio input of the camera. That's where it becomes a bit more of a challenge. Now, two of the nonlinear editors will actually convert that audio timecode, which you recorded to the microphone input, into metadata timecode. So one of those is DaVinci Resolve, and the other one is Avid Media Composer. And I have never used Avid Media Composer. My understanding is that that functionality is pretty solid on there, though. DaVinci Resolve, I have not tried it recently, but what I've found is it works great with their own cameras. But some cameras, for example, my Nikon Z6, not that I shoot a lot of video with that, but I did do a test with it, and it appears that what the Nikon does is it doesn't necessarily start recording the audio immediately. There's a little bit of a delay, so you'll get video for some number of milliseconds before you'll start getting audio. And that trips DaVinci Resolve up, at least last time I tested it. I haven't tested it more recently. So it was probably 6 months ago that I tested it. And they may have fixed this issue, but DaVinci Resolve wouldn't recognize it as timecode if the audio wasn't there right at the very start of the file. So some cameras will trip that up. So that's something to be aware of as well. If you may encounter that issue if you're going to be doing that workflow. Tentacle Sync Studio actually was able to read those where DaVinci Resolve was not. So that's one thing I really like about Tentacle Sync Studio. There's another one, another app out there, and let me just find it here really quickly. Timecode Systems, I think, sells it, and I think Ambient sells it too. But I think it was called Video. The name of the company was called Video Toolshed, I think, and they also have let's see if I can find it here. The Timecode Systems website here. Not seeing it at the moment, but Video Toolshed makes a Timecode app as well. I didn't find it quite, it was very capable, but it wasn't quite as full featured as the Tentacle Sync Studio app. So that's something to consider. There is another option out there. I have used it, and it was okay, not bad. It takes it's kind of it was definitely made by an engineer, not somebody who does UI design. So the UI is a little bit funky, but it definitely did the job. So that's another one to consider. Let's go back to the challenges. I've actually had a pretty good experience with Tentacle Sync Studio. However, there was one challenge that somebody brought up to me today. If you do a multicam shoot with several of the same model cameras, in this particular case, it was an Sony A7 II, I believe. The software couldn't tell the cameras apart, and so it didn't lay them out correctly on the timeline. And the reason for that, according to Tentacle Sync Studio or Tentacle Sync, was that because the metadata that the cameras imprint in their video files or video clips, they couldn't tell the cameras apart, and so it didn't know what to do with the two different clips. They just thought they were from the same camera, and so they stacked them up in a way that wasn't working right. So that is one challenge there. I don't know that it happens with all cameras, but in the case of the A7 II, it was evidently not providing enough metadata for Tentacle Sync to be able to do it. Now, there's a workaround. In that case, what you can do is you'll have to go in, maybe like drop all of the clips from one camera in first, highlight all of them, and manually assign them to a camera group, and then drop all the clips from the other camera in, manually assign them to a different camera group, and then it's able to tell the difference. So there's definitely a workaround there in that case. Also, Tentacle Sync Studio allows you to apply an offset. So for example, if you are doing that workflow with an Atomos recorder, sending timecode directly into the Atomos recorder, you can apply an offset. So if you're consistently seeing a 4-frame discrepancy between your video and your audio clips, you can apply that offset so that Tentacle Sync Studio will say, oh, okay, move everything by 4 frames, and then it will get it all synced up just right. So something to consider there as well. All right, another common one I've been hearing a lot lately is that one camera that's become extraordinarily popular is this guy here. This is the Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. Get this battery that's kind of sitting out here. All right, there we go. Got the battery in. Yeah, so this one is an interesting camera, and the 6K as well, which I've got. Can you see it? There it is, back there. This has a 3.5 millimeter microphone input, which actually doubles as a timecode input as well. So I've had a lot of questions from people asking, hey, can I send audio, or can I send timecode directly out from my Mixpre or my Zoom H6 or my Zoom F8, whatever it may be, directly into camera? I'll keep them, well, there are two things. There are two different workflows there. You can keep it plugged in the entire time to keep them jam synced constantly. The Pocket Cinema camera is actually kind of interesting too, because you can pull it out and it will continue to count timecode using its own internal clock. However, the Blackmagic internal clock is not a crystal oscillator, or sorry, it's not a temperature compensated crystal oscillator like most timecode generators are. So what that means in practical terms is that it will drift, and it will drift fairly quickly. So it's not as if that can be a kind of a replacement for a timecode generator. It'd be something you'd have to jam sync probably I'd say every 30 minutes to 45 minutes, realistically, if you really want them to be in sync pretty well. So that's definitely something to consider. So keep that in mind if you're going to do that workflow. On the other hand, again, if you keep them connected throughout the entire course of the shoot, you're a solo shooter, then that should work just fine. And in my tests, it's worked really well so far. So that's one to consider. The Zoom F6, another timely time code thing to talk about. This is funny. This battery is sticks way out just because I wanted a large capacity battery. But the Zoom F6 has a 3.5 millimeter timecode in and out port. And this one's turns out is a little bit interesting. And this was actually thanks to Gerald Undone that he actually got to this before I did. What we found on this is that the right channel is timecode out on this port, and the left channel is timecode in. Kind of an interesting thing. So if you wanted to do that workflow where you connect a cable from the F6's timecode output into the Pocket Cinema camera's timecode input, the Pocket Cinema camera is actually looking for timecode on the left channel, but this is sending it on the right channel. So what to do? What you can do is just use a standard TRS 3.5 millimeter cable, and then on the Pocket Cinema camera side, you'll use a little connector like this. This is actually a 3.5 millimeter TRS to 3.5 millimeter TS. And so what it does is essentially sums the stereo down to mono and sends that into the Pocket Cinema camera. It then recognizes the time code. So something to keep in mind there if that is something that you're interested in. All right, as we're talking about timecode, there's been some kind of timecode in the news. Timecode Systems, which is a company that makes the UltraSync 1, they make the Wave. What are some of the others they make? The UltraSync Blue, which is a Bluetooth timecode generator, which incidentally also works with the Zoom F6 and I think some of the others as well. So that company, Timecode Systems, was recently bought by Atomos, the company that makes the HDMI and SDI video recorders. It was interesting. I just saw that there was a press release. This is all that they say on the press release. Atomos acquires Timecode Systems, launching a new era for multi-camera content creation. Atomos is proud to announce the acquisition of Timecode Systems, the world's leading wireless timecode and synchronization company. Together, the companies are building tightly integrated multi-camera workflow solutions that unify all devices recording on set and allowing them to work together more cohesively. So I think that's potentially good news, especially for those that are using the Atomos recorders in their workflow. So hopefully that's some good news there. So for those doing that. All right, let's go take a look at the comments here. I think we have, I'm going back to the start so that we can start there. Let's look at, Andre says, I've been struggling with timecode in the Ninja 5 EOS R and the splitter solution. Don't know if the cables have anything to do with it. That could be. But I found, I don't know, Andre, if you're using a powered HDMI splitter, but that's something to consider if you're not. Yes, when I did timecode from the MixPre, this is from Clayton, or from the MixPre 3 to the GH5S via HDMI, there was a delay. Yes, I think most people are finding that there is a delay. And that would be a case where using an offset in post, I assume, Clayton, that the delay or the latency was consistent. So, consistently 3 frames or whatever the case may be. If that's the case, then some of the software will allow you to apply an offset and automatically account for that. So something to consider there. That's one thing that Tentacle Sync Studio does well. Oh, huge delay, half a second. Wow. That is a big one. If it's consistent, again, that's the important thing. As long as it's consistent, you can potentially work with it. Carlos, I once approached a DP and director and asked them if they wanted scratch audio since the camera didn't support timecode. Their minds were blown. Indie and students have no clue about timecode. Absolutely agree. Until you teach them. So that's the secret. The Pocket 4K reads it and converts it from the Tentacle Sync. Amazing. Yeah, that actually is a really good workflow with the Pocket. The Blackmagic cameras, they have plenty of faults. You can see, obviously, I use them. Am I a fan? That's a different discussion. I like them for the most part. They're not perfect, but I do like them. But their timecode implementation is actually quite good. I've been pretty happy with it. So that is good news. Mark, thanks for joining us here. Back to Clayton here. My only complaint about the Tentacle Sync is the challenge of getting the software on other people's computers. That is a very valid point. I'm glad you brought that up. So here's the thing. When you buy a Tentacle Sync or Tentacle Sync E at this point, you get a free license for the Tentacle Sync Studio application. It runs on Mac. They have a kind of a dumbed down version that runs on Windows. Unfortunately, they're definitely a Mac house. The guy, one of the founders, is a developer, but all his coding experience is all on on Mac. So the Windows app, all it does is will convert, if you're recording on a consumer grade camera into the microphone input, it will just convert that from audio timecode into metadata timecode. And then you go into your nonlinear editor to actually do the sync from there. So that's all the Windows app does. The Mac OS app does a lot more. It actually will lay everything out on a timeline for you, and then you can export an XML file for your nonlinear editor. Open that up in your nonlinear editor, and everything is laid out perfectly, synced up on your timeline. It also has a variety of different tools, like it can apply an offset. You can choose where to read the time code for the sync point. So, for example, if you do a long take and there's maybe just a little bit of drift, you can actually tell it to use the middle of the file as the timecode sync part, or you can actually use the end of the file. You have options there. So that's kind of an interesting feature as well. There are a lot of little kind of interesting features in Tentacle Sync Studio that make it a pretty good app. So the problem is, of course, though, as Clayton points out here, that when you buy the Tentacle Sync, if you're working with a team, your editor doesn't necessarily have Tentacle Sync Studio. So there are different ways to go about that. One way you can do it, depending on the project, is one thing that Tentacle Sync Studio can also do is actually do the sync and then re-export the files. So if you put all the video files in, all the audio files in, you can actually re-export the video files. It won't re-encode the video. It'll re-encode it with the audio. It won't change the video at all. So it'll bring in the synced audio and then output that as a new video file. And it actually does it pretty quickly. The problem is that if you're working on a narrative film, if you're working on a camera or a piece where you're using these massive raw files, getting those transferred over to your computer so you can do the sync and then get it back to them is a pain. So there is definitely a challenge there. Now, anyone can go buy a license for Tentacle Sync Studio, but it does cost, and so it's not a free app, unfortunately. In fact, let's go see how much it runs. I think last time I checked, it was let's see, Tentacle Sync. It was approaching $100 as I recall. Maybe it was a little bit more than that. But we'll pull that up here really quickly. So that's definitely something to consider. Yeah, and so that's basically, it sounds like Clayton is doing that exact thing. Basically what you're calling a DIT sync. So you're actually playing, yeah, I don't know if you're doing the DIT work or you're the sound mixer, but in any case, basically you're becoming a DIT and having to do that work. So let's see here, go to the shop. I'm still looking up the price here. All right. Next up from Lloyd, I didn't realize systems weren't linear. Just having a stamp makes things fragile in my mind. Absolutely. Yeah, so it's important to understand how timecode really works. So it's in theory linear, but the reality is that things can change. So Lloyd, I'm sure you've probably worked with word clock on the audio, like in the studio. So it does not work the same as that. Basically, word clock locks everything together, as I understand it, but this doesn't necessarily do that. All right, the Tentacle Sync website is really slow at the moment. The studio software, it's actually $166.37 according to what I'm showing here. Let's see if I change it. Just right now it's set to German. I don't know if it's doing a conversion differently. In any case, that's going a little slowly. We'll get back to this. All right, next up from Mark. Last week I mentioned drones being used as boom handlers. Tonight I just finished attaching a shotgun microphone to a remote control gimbal connected to a remote control slider. That's pretty cool. Hopefully the slider and the gimbal are very quiet. I think a lot of times they are. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I don't know about drones being boom handlers. The trick with drones is I've never heard a quiet drone. They all make quite a racket, but maybe they find a way to make them quieter in time. All right, next up from Carlos. If they have a software that can transform your audio timecode to actual timecode like Resolve, you don't need to add the software. Also, you can ask in pre-production how they will handle timecode and give them solutions. Agreed on all fronts. Now, again, you'll want to do tests with the particular camera that you're working with to make sure that Resolve will read those. Again, some cameras don't start recording their audio right away, and so you can run into those issues there. Clayton. Oh yes, this is something we haven't covered yet. He brings up the question of frame rates. So camera frame rates. 23.98 and 24 frames per second are not the same thing when when it's ever. They're not the same thing, but especially when it comes to time code, you have to set the frame rate correctly. So it has to be set to the same thing that the camera is actually doing, and you need to tease out in some cases, especially consumer cameras don't necessarily make the distinction between 24 frames per second and 23.98, or technically 23.976. And actually, a lot of times people will round up to 9.8. Technically, it's 976. But yeah, you need to get those exactly right, or the time code. There's another problem you could have with time code as well. And yeah, once you make it the same, it's all good. All right, Mike. For me, I find that the Mix Pre 3 audio is early by several frames from my GH5 as opposed to having a latency effect. Have you ever had success with the GH5 being frame accurate over HDMI? No, I think that's what we're talking about, Mike. That is latency, basically. It's that latency over HDMI, and that's why you're getting those sync issues. So I have not tested that really carefully because it's not a workflow I typically use. There's another thing to consider here as well. One of the challenges with HDMI timecode from camera to audio recorder as well is that the HDMI, that whole interface was designed for consumer grade products, to be entirely fair. And especially on the Mix Pre, you have this micro HDMI input. And that to me just seems like the most fragile type of connection. There's nothing locking it in. It's small. It's relatively fragile. So you have to come up with some solution. I'm curious if any of you have come up with a solution to keep, to ensure that thing doesn't come pulling out in the middle of a shoot, and to stabilize it a little bit, because that's one thing that needs to happen in addition to the fact that you're getting this latency effect. Yeah, good point on the frames per second. Some of the Sony cameras claim 24 frames per second. In fact, it's 23.976, so you need to check that for sure. And some cameras do shoot true 24 frames per second and also 23.976. So you have to be careful and make sure you may have to pull out your user manual and dive in. Okay, so here you used Resolve to get timecode from an A7 II, A7R3, and a C300 Mark II, and it all worked beautifully. So that is good news. When it works, it is a beautiful thing. I remember working on a narrative last year when I was telling you about the Uphill Cinema guys. It was their first time. We shot on a Saturday. On Monday, we met again, and I brought in Tentacle Sync Studio, showed them how to do it. And I think that everyone were they were holding their breaths or biting their nails as we were getting ready to set up and do the sync. And it worked flawlessly. Everything worked beautifully. So that's when they became converted to that approach. And I agree, those tentacle syncs, and I think a lot of times people first see the price of a tentacle sync, which, by the way, an individual tentacle sync runs $278.03 as of this very moment on the Tentacle Sync website. A lot of people don't necessarily want to spend that money. And again, this becomes a matter of economics. If it's going to save you hours of work in post, and time is money in your particular case, if it's just a passion project, that's a completely different thing. But if time is money and it costs $278.03 to buy a Tentacle Sync E, it's just a matter of doing a calculation and determining for yourself if it makes sense, if it's worth the time investment. So it's that simple. For YouTube videos, I don't generally find it all that critical. So, all right. Norm, I'm using an Atomos Shogun. I highly recommend sending linear timecode or longitudinal timecode directly into the Shogun via the BNC sync connector. I'm curious, Norm, if you've had to do any sort of offset to make that work. You said it's saved as metadata and keeps all your audio channels free, no messing around in post to have to sync clips and audio from the recording using native metadata timecode. That's great. So if you haven't experienced any sort of challenges in terms of offsets, then that is a great workflow. Let's see. Furworks. I really wish Resolve would add the ability to pull timecode from WAV files. It works perfectly for embedded audio, but isn't an option for dual system audio. Let me see if I understand your question. I've had no luck trying to just jam sync and free run the Pocket 4K. The timecode jumps all over the place, even not turning it off. When keeping a constant timecode into it, though, it works fine. Okay, so that's been my experience as well. I'm not sure I followed this comment here, though, for Works. I really wish Resolve would add the ability to pull timecode from WAV files. There actually is an option to convert audio timecode to metadata timecode. Last I checked. So I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but I believe that is there. Something definitely worth checking. Up from Mark Owens, had Hassel Windows version Tentacle Sync, got a secondhand Mac Pro. Tentacle Sync software works. It cost me $1,000. It's easier now. I'm old and a bit thick. I think I had tried DaVinci not properly every time. Okay. So yeah, again, it sounds like in your case, Tentacle Sync worked a little bit more reliably as well. Ooh, taking bets on timecode generators being included in the next Atomos units. Well, they do have, for the Ninja 5, they do have their, what do they call it? Somebody asked me about it the other day. It's a product that they actually announced some time ago, but as far as I know, it's not shipping yet. It's a sync add-on for the Ninja 5, and it works wirelessly. Let's click on expansion. It's called the Atom X Sync. Wouldn't be surprised if they worked with Timecode Systems on that, but basically what it is I believe it's a timecode generator, and it's also able to wirelessly, I think, stay in sync with all of the other Atomos recorders. So I assume they worked with Timecode Systems on this and used a lot of their technology, which they'd already developed. So it'll be interesting to see if that becomes kind of a standard feature on those Atomos recorders. Okay, sorry, Norm, not sure I followed that. That may be in regards to the including timecode generators on all of the Atomos recorders. All right, Scott, I have a friend who is using a Rode VideoMic Pro into her Panasonic GX85 and has a lot of problem with wind noise. The wind muff that comes with it does not do a great job. Recommendations? Absolutely. So this is not a timecode sync or a timecode question, but it is a valid, very important thing to understand. So my experience has been that there are different types of wind protection to put on microphones when you're using them outdoors. The foam wind covers that come with them really are mainly for plosives. That's for P's and B's and keeping that from creating that sort of overwhelming plosive sound on your microphone. That's basically all those are good for, and for maybe the very, very, very slightest of breezes. All this does is applies just a little bit of diffusion to that wind or that air moving as it comes into the microphone capsule. So that's not generally going to be enough. Then you can buy, like for example, Rode sells their dead cats, and the dead cats are these furry covers that you then put over the foam. Those help a tiny bit more, but again, still not a whole lot. So if you're out in the wind, you're still likely to pick up, if it's anything more than the slightest of breezes, you're still likely to pick up some wind sound. So the it's kind of the best strategy for dealing with wind, in my experience, is you have to put some space between the diffusion material and the microphone. And that's why things like a blimp cover or a cyclone or Zeppelin cover, the big covers that you see the location sound guys using, that's really like if you're having a lot of wind problems, that's really kind of the solution. The least expensive, kind of reliable, good quality of those that I've seen is the Rode Blimp. It's about $300. So that could be something that will make people, it's not really made for the Video Mic Pro either. There are some other Rycote products you can use that work a little bit better than the included foam and Dead Cat. But again, those aren't going to protect you they'll only protect up to a certain point. And again, once you get past a certain point, wind is going to make its way through there because you've got the foam sitting right against the microphone capsule and it can't diffuse all the wind quickly enough before it hits the capsule. So that's the issue. That's the physics of the issue that you're running into there. So hopefully there's some thoughts there that are helpful. All right, Clayton is full of great information tonight. Also, totally rad timecode trick I did. I tentacle synced timecode into my MixPre 3, then piped it out to my H4n to add more channels. I find myself needing an extra input from time to time. There you go. If you need to add channels, there's another option for you. I'm going to choose the Rode NT55 AKG C35 and Sennheiser 416 mic to record a musician playing instruments and singing. Do those mic make a good combination? You're going to use the Zoom F4 recorder. Let's see. I have experience with the NT5, which I believe has the same capsule as the NT55. Maybe not, actually. The NT55, I believe, has like a high-pass filter and I think it has maybe some other things too. I don't know if it has a variable polar pattern or not. And I have experience, of course, with the MKH416, the Sennheiser. I do not have experience with the AKG C35, but those all seem like good quality microphones. I wouldn't have any hesitation definitely giving those a try if you've got them already, especially. I think maybe some of the others of you have experience with some of those, and you could pipe in with your experience and your opinions on that. That'd be great. Alan, I have a MixPre 3 to GH5, but it's too busy for me to hook it up all the time, struggling to find a simpler solution. Alan, yeah, if you're not coming home with a lot of clips, again, I just use a clapper board, slate, or even just clap the hands and just sync manually that way. That's what I do. So that's an option. And then Norm also sends return audio from the bag to the camera just in case. So yeah, that's a good idea. So you've got a backup there on the camera as well. With all the timecode issues you mentioned, it baffles that all these companies are putting out what seems to be shoddy timecode. There should be a standard for all cameras and nonlinear editors. Well, so let me clarify that a little bit. So SMPTE has defined a standard for timecode. And it's actually, it's an audio signal, to be honest. It's an audio signal that is encoded timecode. And so that has been defined. What's different is that on HDMI, that's a digital interface. So it's not carrying an audio signal. And I don't know. This is where someone is going to if somebody knows better than me, there may well be somebody here in the audience that does. But I don't believe a standard for sending timecode over HDMI has been defined. And that could just be a matter of, the group that is responsible for defining the HDMI standard to build that into the standard, instead of having all the different camera manufacturers kind of do their own thing. So it sounds like that's my understanding, but if somebody knows more details, definitely share with that here. What's your take on Pluralized sync software? I think Pluralized can be great. However, it's not foolproof either. Just like Timecode's not foolproof, Pluralize is not foolproof. It depends on capturing good scratch audio as well. So if you're doing a take, someone quite a ways away, that's going to be a challenge. And, sometimes the camera operator isn't always going to be paying attention to the scratch mic. So you just have to make sure that you're getting a good audio signal on your mic. And if you do, then Pluralized works beautifully. It's a really, really nice app. But if people aren't paying attention, then you gotta be careful. Ripping your hair out for 0.02 of a second. Indeed. Good point on the audio recording start point being different on some cameras. I've been having a heck of a time syncing a G7, G85 to the Pocket 4K on Timecode. There's a variable delay to the audio. Yeah, definitely see that especially on the consumer grade cameras, unfortunately. What is the difference between drop and non-drop frame? That is a huge discussion. I would recommend you actually go to Wikipedia and read up on that. It's something more than we can cover here. So let's go to, let me just pull that up here really quickly. In fact, if you go to the SMT timecode entry at Wikipedia, it will talk about the difference between drop frame and non-drop frame. You need to have the same thing going on your camera and the same setting on your timecode generator. So if you're using drop frame on the camera, you've got to be using drop frame on your timecode generator. And if you're not, you need to not be using it on your timecode generators as well. So definitely, if you want to get into the gory details of drop versus non-drop frame, definitely check that out on Wikipedia. Just look at the SMT timecode page. All right, Zach. I've been syncing cams with scratch audio with no issues. It seems that cameras running with scratch audio is more reliable than timecode at this moment in the prosumer world. Do you agree? More reliable? I think it's I think it's a simpler workflow if you don't have a ton of different clips that you're bringing home. Again, if you, yeah, I think that's probably the best way to put it. If doing scratch audio dual sound system workflow is working for you, I'd definitely say stick with it. But once you start getting into narrative films or anything where you're going to come home with a whole lot of clips, that's when it starts to make more sense. Now, I guess this is a fair point that you bring up, Zach. I think I've been talking a lot on this session about the challenges of using timecode. I will say this. I think it's actually fairly simple. Free run timecode in particular, where you have an external timecode generator like a Tentacle Sync E, you jam that to your mix pre. You then go take that and attach the timecode generator to the camera, and you're good. You make sure that you're getting the timecode into the camera. It's a pretty simple workflow, and it's not that difficult, but it's just one more thing. But if you can nail that and you get the frame rate set correctly, then it's really straightforward. In post, it is a dream to work with. So I think maybe I've been sounding a little pessimistic about timecode here. I don't mean to. All I'm saying is that there are times when it makes sense to use timecode and times when it probably doesn't make sense. And I think one of the things I want to do too, based on all the questions I've gotten about HDMI timecode, is that is a messier world by its nature. There are workflows that work, certain cameras and certain audio recorder connection or combinations that work great, but there are some others that just don't work great. So just something to keep in mind. But definitely, if the old-fashioned using a clap at the start of a take is working for you, by all means, stick with it for sure. Okay, Alan Moore, I could barely fit the 12-inch cable from GH5 to MixPre 3. Really awkward. Alternative was getting much longer cable, which isn't conducive to a one-man show. Yeah, there are challenges there too. And then back to Norm. Norm did not need an offset. That's amazing, Norm. That is great news. Tentacle Sync in Australia is $435. Wow. That's a lot of money for a timecode generator. I wonder if some of the others are less expensive. If you look up Ambient and look at their timecode generators, look at Timecode Systems. I wonder if any of those are less expensive, more affordable. The Timecode Systems in UltraSync, by the way, is a really cool one. It actually communicates wirelessly with all the other ultrasync ones and ultrasync blues. And so they never drift out from each other. They're constantly using wireless to communicate and stay in sync. Pretty cool system. Downside is that the batteries run out a little faster, but that still generally will get you through most production days, so something to consider. Without prior knowledge of timecode, I assumed that everything would just be wireless and devices would just sync with a central unit every X seconds and use their own clocks a la network time protocol. That's true. That's exactly what I just described on the Timecode Systems. The Tentacle Sync has an not exactly the same approach, but a different approach. Their approach is you can open an app on your iPhone, tap a button, and that will wirelessly rejam all of the timecode generators. So you don't have to do it constantly, which is good from the standpoint that you don't use the battery as much by constantly transmitting wireless. But you can rejam whenever you need to. So that seems to me like a pretty interesting kind of middle ground, whereas Timecode Systems takes a kind of hardcore approach of constantly staying in sync by constantly wirelessly transmitting. So the audio timecode to metadata timecode isn't an option for audio files, only for video files when right-clicking in the editor. Oh, I'm sorry. I get your point now for works. If you just add a black frame and convert it to a video file, it works. Okay, I see. That makes sense. With Betso timecode and ambient and timecode systems have a way of doing that in terms of the pricing, yes. You can get an app running on a computer and even add metadata to the clips with timecode. Another option. It's expensive, as in rent expensive XD. Usually you can find those on big budget productions. Thanks for that, Carlos. And then one last one, it looks like, from Carlos. Sadly, oh wait, let's go back to Mark. I was shocked by the prices. I'd have thought Bluetooth or Wi-Fi would be able to easily nail sync with a few thousandths of a second. Sadly, no, it's a complicated thing, especially since we have all types of frequencies going on. You need some algorithm to keep everything smooth and functions and lots more. Yeah, agreed. That's why. So this wireless syncing has taken that's a fairly recent thing, actually. All right. Carlos chimes in with, for smaller projects, you can use Tentacle, set it up properly, make sure everything works, and forget about it. Also, you can get Denicky and have more peace of mind, but it requires more knowledge. So yeah, the setup is a little bit more, a little more involved. Archie, can the audio limited A10 suffice as a wireless hop to a camera? It could, but I don't think it's not really set up for that. And here's why: the receivers on the A10 system are slot systems. So I guess if you're using a camera that has a slot in, yeah, that would be great. But I assume you're talking about more consumer-oriented cameras. In that case, probably not a great option, just because you've got that slot receiver, which is quite large, fairly heavy, and it needs power. It doesn't have any sort of inbuilt battery or any slot for batteries. You have to attach it. It's basically made to go in a sound bag or in a slot system, which is supplying power. So maybe not the best fit in that case. I'm glad you reviewed the Aperture MC. The 4-pack seems like a very versatile videographer kit. So for those that weren't aware, we did a review just recently of the Aperture MC. They're these little LED lights, RGB W lights. Pretty cool. All right, back to Carlos. Oh, this is in regards to using the A10. Sure, or yes, just make sure the audio is not clipping in the camera. I use Sennheiser G3. Using audio limit is a bit much since those are not cheap, but yeah, it works. Yeah, I mean, technically it would work, but again, keep in mind that the receivers are quite large. So I'm not sure most camera operators are going to want one of those tacked to their camera. And yeah, I think that G3, G4 is probably a better option. Again, if it's not critical that it be the highest quality, that can definitely work. Okay, Zach, regarding my super chat, I'm recording myself playing drums, multicam with no time code, and never have drift in the different cameras. That is awesome. By the way, Zach, where do we hear and see some of your drumming? I actually have a kit. I am not a great drummer because I have been too busy making videos instead of practicing drums. But would love to see what you're doing there. Peter chimes in, Tentacle Sync is $542 in New Zealand. Ouch. I don't know if that's for a pair or just one, but that is pretty pricey. For two, that would be reasonable. For one, that's pretty high. Tentacle Sync Timecode I have been using with my Zoom F8N and Boom and Actors. 3 off with Sennheiser G3, G4 timecode, a must when you have 80 to 90 clips minimum. Yeah, I agree. Once you start getting into those situations, definitely. The Betso TCX2 timecode transceiver looks very good. I agree. I have never actually used the Betso, Lloyd. Heard a lot of people talk about them, and I think they do a similar thing where they do the, yeah, as you say, the transceiver. So it's doing a wireless constant jam. Looks pretty cool as well. Okay, back to Archie. Analog wireless such as a Sennheiser has another benefit of only needing a single transmitter to multiple receivers if you're doing a multicam shoot. Agree, A10 is too nice. Yeah, unfortunately. In New Zealand, $542 for just one tentacle sync. My goodness, that's crazy. Ultimate Ears, JH Audio, Weststone. I have a request for you to review high-end custom molded in-ear monitors. That is a brilliant idea. I would love to get into some of those. So, um, in any case, yeah. So hopefully I can do that. Yes, I was actually doing some research on that. Incidentally, let me just mention that right now. Um, many of you have probably heard of Gotham Sound. Gotham Sound has a YouTube channel. Gotham Sound, for those aren't familiar, is a professional sound house. They have locations in New York, Atlanta. Can't remember if they have them anywhere else, but True Audio is another one. They're based in Los Angeles, but also Atlanta. Um, in any case, what Gotham Sound has on their YouTube channel is they often kind of review some of the higher end gear as it becomes available. But one of the episodes I was watching last night was really interesting, was a discussion with an audiologist. And this was a woman, her name is Dr. Sinat, I believe. And she was a location sound mixer and then went back to school and got a doctoral degree and is now an audiologist. And she works largely with musicians and location sound mixers and production sound mixers, and kind of helps them identify where their hearing is at. And their company actually makes in-ear monitors, some really kind of high end. And they use a lot of them are actually kind of made out of the in-ear monitors are made out of harder materials. But this particular company, and I don't remember what the name of the company is now. Darn it. But if you go to Gotham Sound to their YouTube channel, you should be able to find it. And in any case, they use silicone, so they're custom molded in-ear monitors. So they take an impression of your ear and then actually make a model specifically for your ears. And it's made out of silicone, so it's a lot more comfortable. And that's, I think, important because the reality is, and it doesn't affect production sound mixers as much, but like musicians on stage, when they're using these, as you move your mouth, your ear canal changes shape some. And so there's some challenges with those harder materials, and the silicone sound like they're a lot more comfortable. So in any case, when I do review those at some point, I would like to take a look at some of the silicone ones as opposed to the harder materials. Zach, for the drumming, using two G85s and a G7 Rode mic, same frame rate on all cams. Only time I've ever seen drift was trying to integrate my friend's iPad footage into the G85 G7 video. Was probably a 30 frames versus 24. Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. That is great. So if you've got a workflow, again, that's working, stick with it. Did we talk about the Sony camera time code with the mix pre's? Yes, we did earlier. Well, with the mixed pre's, we talked about the Sony camera and the tentacle syncs, but not with the mixed pre's. So, No, we have not talked about that specifically. So if you do have a question, let's definitely get that in the chat here. Would love to let's talk about it. Let's see where you're at with that. Yes, we pay top dollar in Australia. Just got the Zoom F6 from the US, 649 US dollars, 987 Australian dollars. They want 1399 Australian dollars here. Wow. Electronics are not cheap there. All right. Aaron, welcome to the session here. Glad you could join even if it was 55 minutes late. I wonder what Technical Sync would say if I emailed them asking how their devices would react to gravitational and relativistic time dilation just in case the International Space Station needed one. Well, you do that and you let us know. We would be fascinated to know. Curtis Judd Drums, new channel coming soon. Unfortunately, not unless someone is able to figure out how to get me an additional 4 to 5 hours per day, which maybe Mark can do that based on what he's talking about with time shifts. Okay. Does sending timecode to your camera via audio cable mean you lose the ability to send it scratch audio? So that's a good point and a good question. It depends. So if you're sending timecode to your camera with something like a tentacle sync, and a lot of the newer timecode generators do this, the timecode generator, the tentacle sync E, for example, has a microphone built into it. So what it does is it sends timecode into your camera on the left channel, and it sends the audio from its own little kind of scratch microphone into the right channel. So you get the best of both worlds. So you'll just want to make sure that if you are looking for a solution like that, that's something to take into account. So there's some thoughts on that one. What's the controller with faders sitting behind you, and what happened to the SQ5? Oh, this is just the Rode. What's it called? The Rodecaster Pro? I don't remember what it's called. Oh yeah, it's the Rodecaster Pro. So it's more of a kind of a podcasting kind of recorder interface. The SQ5 is definitely still here. I am in the process of working on a custom cart for the SQ5. It hasn't gone away. In fact, it's seen a little bit more use. I use it with Pro Tools now as a controller, a control surface when I'm doing mixing of larger jobs. So I'm looking for the right cart for it. I've got a cart on the way. It's just a little AV cart, but it's something where I don't use it all the time. So I need it to be able to kind of roll up to my desk when I need it. So we're working on that. It hasn't gone away. You can use a splitter cable and send timecode to one channel and use an external mic to record audio on the other channel. You do lose it. You do lose the on-camera mics though. Okay, there's another option there for you. Aaron, New Zealand is really difficult for buying stuff. You have to use Australia's Amazon and eBay. TradeMe, which is New Zealand's auction site, is more expensive for secondhand than from the UK. Oh, challenges there. On the other hand, New Zealand looks like a very beautiful place to live, so maybe there's a trade-off there. Little trade-off. 280 pounds for a single timecode unit in the UK at the moment. That's 1/4 of a Blackmagic Pocket 4K. Sensophonics, that's the one, Lloyd. Thank you. So for those of you that were listening earlier, when we're talking about the in-ear monitors, Sensophonics is the brand. So definitely worth checking out. I would love to try some of those. By the way, Lloyd, have you... Thank you for being my personal YouTube researcher. I appreciate that. I'm curious, have you used Sensophonics or have you used any other in-ear monitors or anyone else? I'm curious what your experience has been with those. Gonna buy the MixPre 6.2. Never used timecode before, but pretty excited. Okay, stick around. By the way, I do have a video that demonstrated using the Tentacle Sync E on a multi-camera shoot over on my main channel. So go to do a search for Curtis Judd, Tentacle Sync E, and you'll find that episode if you're interested in that particular episode there. What are your opinions on devices such as the Zoom Live Tracks? I have not used the Live Tracks from Zoom. So I don't really have an opinion. I One guy that I watch on YouTube a fair bit, he doesn't post a whole lot, but when he does, they're usually really good quality, is Ray Ortega. He's a podcaster, and he took a look at the first live track, the L12, I think it was, or L8. I don't remember which one, whichever one was the first one that came out a couple of years ago. Um, and I think his review was pretty helpful. I didn't end up buying one, and I haven't reviewed one. Um, it seems decent, but I don't have a strong opinion because I've never actually touched it. So, but it looks like it's pretty decent. I did the one knob compressor looked pretty nice to you work with if you're if you're not really familiar with how compressors work or you don't want to have to spend a lot of time. That looked kind of interesting. So that was definitely something looking at. Uh, okay. Next question. How does the sound cart guy work alongside the DIT cart in a video village? I've never done that. I've never been that guy, Archie. We need someone like Michael Wynn on here to talk to us about that. Um, my understanding, however, is that usually the sound mixer will sit. They'll have their own area within Video Village, or maybe a little outside of Video Village. Sometimes they like to get away from the generators, so they might move a little farther away. But they really like to prefer to have it quiet, and be able to really focus on their mixing. So I don't know that it's necessarily right next to the DIT cart guy, but it's going to depend. It's going to depend on every production is going to be a little bit different depending on how much space there is, what the production mixer's preferences are, you know, what the production is defined for where they can go and be, so on and so forth. But there are a lot of different considerations there. Ah, thank you, Lloyd, again. Back to Zach. What state are you in? I would love to help you with any live sound audio gigs. I'm in Illinois near Chicago. I thought you were talking about Sensophonics. I'm about to buy some of their earplugs. Yes. Zach, we'd love to hear how those work out for you. Those looked really, really awesome. Now, people need to understand these are expensive in ear monitors. We are talking, I think, the least expensive in ear monitors I saw on their website. And again, these are custom built for your ears, were $600 US, and they went up from there. And there were some that were several $1,000s. And the idea again is you would go to an audiologist in your local area, you would get an impression of your ear, you'd send it over to Sensophonics, and then they would build you your custom set of in-ear monitors. And then Zach, what state are you in? I'm in Utah, so I'm in Park City, Utah, up in the mountains. Um, a little bit of a drive from Chicago, but if I ever happen to drop by Chicago, I may look you up and we'll go get dinner or something. Can you imagine being the only person to bring a timecode slate to a shoot for the second AC to look at you and be all like, "Your sound, but gimme." Yes, actually, I can imagine that. Depends on the level of production. You're talking about a second AC. A lot of the things I work on don't have second ACs, so. But yes, I can imagine. This is a great question, and it's come up several times. Do you find the audio tools in Resolve 16 to be sufficient, or do you still feel the need for a DAW like Pro Tools? That's a fantastic question, and I think it depends on the particular project. I have done a little bit of mixing in Fairlight within DaVinci Resolve 16. Found it to be pretty good. If the post team is working in DaVinci Resolve, it makes it a little easier. There's also the remote feature, which I haven't had a chance to use yet, but you can actually remotely connect. So that's a pretty cool feature. I don't know how well and how well that works and how mature it is just yet, but in any case, I think that in terms of the tool set, it's getting there. I think the latest version before the one that came out just last week, I think it was, had some issues with drawing the waveform, so people were a little frustrated with that, but I have yet to get in there and see if they fixed that. But I think overall, yeah, I think it still has some rough edges, but I think it is probably sufficient for most workflows. So something to consider. Musician earplugs, $170, custom molded earplugs with interchangeable dB filters. Interesting. Is that what you're using right now? And then, yes, Sensophonics is in Chicago in the United States. Slav Guns would like to say, thank you, but I hate you. Ever since starting to watch you, I'm getting nuts about audio quality and adding more and more audio equipment. Part 1 of 2. Let's get this second one. My plans for covering a large trade show now have me looking at 2 other microphones, so thanks, but I hate you. Love you too, buddy. Lloyd has used a custom pair of in-ear monitors with Sony drivers. It was a small company at AES in New York in the 90s, who I don't recall, but they were very good. I prefer the in-ear monitors. Hey, where'd it go? Oh, there it is. I prefer the in-ear monitors that allow ambient sound through. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I think for production sound, you're generally going to want a little bit of isolation usually, but I don't, but Lloyd, and maybe in some cases there would be situations where, um, yeah, there may be situations where you would want a little bit of audio coming through, but you wouldn't wear them outdoors without the ambient. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Post Malone moved to North Utah. You guys should collab. Good to know. I'll check that opportunity out. In-ear, look at companies who do custom earplugs for competitive shooters. We have those, and you can also get them done with headphones. Can likely be far less expensive. Interesting. That's worth looking at. So you're coming at it from the firearms point of view. Hadn't considered that, but definitely worth looking at. Lots of great options for dinner here in Chicago. I have heard that. I actually have had friends who lived in Chicago, and they say one of the things they miss most about Chicago is that the food scene was amazing there. So uh, I don't make it out to Chicago very often. In fact, I've only really flown through, um, going through O'Hare there. I'm from Chicago. Okay, we're talking about restaurants now. Then also the Sensophonics does have some options for ambient sound as well. Have you done much live work? I've mixed a couple of musicals and it's quite the thrill. No, not a lot. I've done a little bit. I did some kind of like a Celtic festival. So I operated sound front of house for one of the venues at a Celtic festival. And it's hard. And that was one of those situations where you have a new act coming through every 45 minutes, and half of them give you, their stage info, their stage sheets. Half of them don't. So it's just madness, pure madness. And I have nothing but respect for really good front of house sound reinforcement engineers. That is a tough, tough job. And I've done a little bit, but not a lot. And honestly, it scares me sometimes. The stakes weren't too terribly high in this particular case. And um, at one point, one of the bands came on and they had something like, I don't know, 24 channels coming in. And they had their manager there who actually typically mixes their shows. And we ended up having to have him sit down next to me to get that whole mess worked out. Because again, they hadn't sent me a stage sheet ahead of time. And I had, for for goodness sake, I mean, it's 24 input channels coming. It was just crazy. And it was this it was an interesting room because it was just like this big rectangular brick building with very little to dampen the sound in there. And, there were 24 input channels, and I think there were probably 20 musicians up on stage for this one act. It just nuts. Absolutely crazy. So, singers probably want some ambience. That's a good point when you're talking about in-ear monitors. Great point. When using my audio plugins in Premiere Pro, I noticed some audio glitching, but on the same laptop using Reaper, there is no glitching. Do you think my computer is using too much power when in Premiere? Absolutely, yeah. Premiere, as soon as you add video to the situation, to the scenario, it's using a lot more resources on that computer. So definitely a lot more challenging for a computer to keep up. So especially on a laptop, usually. All right, Mark, it's 4 a.m. your time. It's time to go. Alarm goes off in 3 hours. Yeah, you better get to bed. All right, my daughter's in Psalm in Chicago. Archie, random fun question. How tall are you? I'm 6'7". Last time I checked. Well, depends on who you ask. Some people say 6'6", some 6'7". I think that I'm probably 6'6" and 4/10. Question about timecode and wireless audio. With the delay from wireless, how does one make sure that timecode lines up correctly with wired sources? Uh, well, I think that's why a lot of so here's the thing. With wireless, the latency is not as big of a thing typically with the analog systems, and with the digital professional systems of what they've done a lot of engineering to keep the latency really, really low. So we're talking really, really low latency, like 3 or 4 milliseconds. And in those cases, it doesn't really affect sync in any sort of substantial way. So basically, they do nothing in those. They don't have to do anything special. If you're talking about consumer wireless systems, and unfortunately, that's going to even include things like the Sennheiser AVX. That one actually, and the Deity Connect, those have 19 millisecond latencies. That starts to affect sync a little bit. And so in those cases, you probably need to nudge, or you need to use an offset for the wireless channels. But it's not an easy, it's not an easy solution. So usually when you're getting into the level of production where you're using timecode, you're also using fairly professional grade wireless systems as well. So that's something to consider. If you are, if you're not totally invested in wireless systems yet, that's a consideration I would take into account when you're trying to decide which wireless system to go with. If it is a digital system, look at its latency and check to see what that looks like. And even I don't know if any of the analog systems have any sort of substantial amount of latency, but that's something to look into as well. Premiere Pro doesn't handle plugins well, especially with latency look ahead like limiters. Good to know. Yeah. Just to add on the in-ear, I wear earplugs for 8+ hours. The silicone ones can provide solid noise isolation. I also tried more expensive latex ones. While they are lighter and provide similar isolation, after a while they start feeling hard in the ear. Good to know. We're going to have to wrap this up here pretty soon, folks. I'm wanting to do some 360 VR. I have the Sound Devices MixPre 10T Gen 1, but the 2 with 32-bit float is intriguing. Any thoughts for this application? For ambisonic recording. Not something I have experience with, unfortunately, not yet. Again, my thoughts on the 32-bit float, wide dynamic range recording capability of the generation or the Series 2 MixPre and the Zoom F6 is that it's useful in a fairly limited set of circumstances. So if you don't have control, like if there's a good chance that you're going to have extraordinarily wide dynamic range for those VR recordings where, you're just going to find yourself in a situation and you aren't going to necessarily be able to set the levels ahead of time to accommodate some extraordinarily loud thing, then yeah, maybe it could be helpful. So those are my thoughts on that. Hopefully that makes sense and is useful in some way. Talking about in-ears again, Lloyd is talking about the ambiance. And actually, if you can adjust the amount of ambiance that comes in, that's pretty cool. I know the new, this is not at all the Pro. Oh, it's funny, they're called Pro, but the new Apple AirPod Pro evidently has that sort of. Interesting. Stephen, I have a pair of the Sensaphonics musician earplugs that are 10 years old and still going strong, still fit well. I heard recently that Costco is now doing custom earplugs. Lots of good options. Interesting. No idea that Costco, of all places, I'd never figured that Costco would have something like that. Any recommendations for audio hardware controller for Adobe Audition CC? I use a Behringer X-Touch Compact for multi-track dialogue editing from the Zoom F8N. Not a big fan with limited control functions. To be honest, that is why I moved to Pro Tools for when I'm doing that type of work. So no, I wish I did have a good recommendation, but it seems like Adobe's been sort of ignoring the support for control surfaces on Audition. And maybe they have done some stuff under the covers, but just haven't documented it well. I'm not sure, but I couldn't find a way to make my SQ5 work with Audition despite hours and hours of trying. And interestingly, when you're coming from the music world, it seems like Audition is not really that popular amongst the musician crowd. It's more popular in the filmmaking crowd, kind of the indie filmmaking crowd. So anyway, there's some thoughts there. Unfortunately, I wish I had some better input for you, Scott, on that, but I got frustrated, and after several hours of attempting, I decided to go with Pro Tools. So, not, I mean, that's a big deal to change out your DAW for something like that. But anyway, some thoughts there. Hey, have you tried the Telefunken M62 small diaphragm FET condenser microphone, hypercardio, only 5 dB of self noise? I have not. I sure would like to though. Telefunken's got some history, some street cred. I'd love to do it. We're using the Machine MK2 with Reaper as a MIDI controller. You know what, guys? We got to wrap this up. Okay, we're going to go down to Slavguns has the last comment here, and then we'll have to wrap it up here. Anyway, there's a Machine Mark II with Reaper as a MIDI controller. That's interesting. That's a possibility. So that again would involve changing DAWs, but yeah, unfortunately, that I wish Adobe would focus a little bit more on that. It seems like they do have. Actually, I take that back. There is one, but it's not. It's only a single fader. It is. It is called the fader port from PreSonus, and I don't know if they ever got. There is actually also PreSonus makes a multi-channel fader port as well. I don't know if they ever got that working in Adobe Audition. They said they were working on it, but then we never heard anything about it again. At least I never did. So anyway, there's some thoughts there. I think they did have support when I went to the Adobe booth probably 2 or 3 years ago at NAB. They had there's some little control surfaces that again, not if you didn't like the Behringer, I doubt you'd like these, but this was sort of a kind of I don't know. It looked kind of consumery to me, but what it was is it was a whole system of different controls that you could kind of snap together. I don't remember what it was called, but they supported those, and you could get as many faders as you wanted. I think it could support up to 8, but it didn't look that for a hardcore audio person. That didn't look like the best choice to me. But again, I don't know. All right, next up, affordable recorders you recommend that offer 32-bit float, comlink, and an output for wireless hop. Well, there aren't very many that do that. I think that you're really probably looking, and actually technically the Zaxcom units don't do 32-bit float, but they have their own kind of proprietary never clip thing, which kind of serves the same purpose. They have comlink on their Nomad for sure. I don't think their Max does. I think you have to move up to the Nomad, I think. I'm not positive. I don't use Zaxcom gear well, I've seen them and I've touched them at NAB and kind of played around with them, but never actually done it. So I think that comlink is going to be the hard part. You can rig something up sort of on other recorders. So if you're just looking at 32-bit float, right now, that's going to be on the really high end, I think, like Sonosax gear, or it's going to be in the consumer grade gear, like the Zoom F6 and the Mix Pre from Sound Devices. So that's an interesting combination that we're not seeing a lot of just yet. Thanks again, Zach. Thanks for coming by. And then from Jacob, follow up to the Resolve Fairlight question. What do you use for mastering loudness compliance? I keep having to round trip to other software, and it'd be great to eliminate that step. I'm doing that, and I'm round tripping. So I'm going to RX. I actually like RX Audio Editor the most for that. In some cases, I will use Adobe Audition for that as well, but I'm generally not doing it in Fairlight. And the problem is in Fairlight, it's just a pain. So if you've got a 10-minute piece, you have to run through the whole thing in real time. You can't just click a button and say, hey, give me my overall loudness reading here, unfortunately. So, all right. Cabela's has Whoa. Custom plugs. So Cabela's also does these custom fit air plugs and hearing tests. Interesting. All right, people. Thank you all so much. There's been some great input here tonight. I really appreciate everyone's participating here. Thanks for providing so many insights here. I know I certainly couldn't answer all these questions on my own. Appreciate everyone that kind of chips in and helps out with that. Get out there and make some great sound. We'll talk to you guys again soon. Take care, everybody.